I found a giant Bigfoot, a creature of a size I thought impossible. But the way I found it, all tied up to a tree with a sign with strange symbols on it, was beyond disturbing. But what happened next made me rethink everything I thought I knew about the forest, nature, and us humans. I am sure never in my life will I find anything stranger than what happened in that forest. I'm a forestry surveyor, and I spend most of my time alone in the Pacific Northwest mapping remote timber areas for logging companies. It's solitary work, which suits me fine. I've heard all the Bigfoot stories from locals over the years. Campfire tales about massive hairy creatures lurking in the woods. I always figured people were seeing bears standing upright or just making things up for attention. That was before I found one tied to a tree with a message carved into wood hanging around its neck. 3 weeks back, I was doing routine survey work in this isolated valley about 40 miles from the nearest logging road. The company wanted detailed topographical maps before they committed equipment and crews to the area. I'd been out there for 5 days, working my way through dense forest, taking measurements, marking boundaries. It was quiet work, peaceful even, with just the sounds of birds and wind through the trees. On that 5th day, around mid-afternoon, I heard something that didn't fit the usual forest soundtrack. It started as a low grunting sound, rhythmic and strained, like something struggling. Mixed in with it was this whimpering noise that made my skin crawl. I stopped what I was doing and listened. At first I thought maybe it was an injured animal, a deer caught in something, or a bear cub separated from its mother. The sounds were coming from somewhere to the east, deeper into the valley. I grabbed my pack and followed the noise, moving carefully through the underbrush. The grunting got louder as I pushed through a thick stand of ferns. Then I stepped into this clearing and everything just stopped making sense. There was this massive hemlock tree standing alone in the middle of the open space, probably 8 feet around at the base. And tied to that tree was something I couldn't process at first. My brain kept trying to categorize it as something familiar. A person, a bear, anything that made sense. But it was neither. It was a Bigfoot, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark reddish-brown fur that was matted and dirty. Thick rope made from twisted vines and strips of bark bound it tightly to the tree trunk. The creature's arms were pulled back around the tree, secured at the wrists with multiple layers of binding. More rope wrapped around its torso and legs, cinched so tight it was cutting into the fur. It had clearly been there for days, maybe weeks. The bindings had cut deep into the fur at the wrists and ankles, leaving raw patches of skin visible underneath. The Bigfoot looked exhausted, dehydrated, defeated. Its chest rose and fell with labored, shallow breathing. Flies buzzed around the food scraps at its feet. The smell of unwashed fur and waste hung in the air. This creature was suffering and had been for a long time. I just stood there frozen for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. Every instinct told me to run. But then the Bigfoot noticed me. Its head lifted and our eyes met. I expected to see rage or aggression, maybe fear. Instead, the look in those eyes was something else entirely. Desperation, pleading, almost human in its clarity. The Bigfoot didn't struggle against the ropes or make threatening sounds. It just looked at me with this expression I can only describe as begging. Hanging from a rope around the Bigfoot's neck was a wooden sign about the size of a dinner plate, maybe 10 inches across. The wood was smooth, worn like it had been handled many times. Someone had carved symbols and crude drawings into it with great care. I forced myself to move closer, keeping a safe distance, but near enough to see the details clearly. The sign showed multiple Bigfoot figures carved in rough outline, maybe 5 or 6 of them, standing together in what looked like a group. One figure was separated from the others, set apart and isolated on the far edge of the sign. This separated figure was marked with a deep X carved across its chest, the cut deeper and more aggressive than the other carvings. Arrows pointed away from that marked figure toward the edges of the sign, suggesting exile or banishment. Below all the images were tally marks cut into the wood in neat groups of 5. I counted them twice to be sure. 37 marks total. Someone had been counting days, keeping careful track of time. This wasn't random cruelty. This was organized punishment with a specific duration. I started circling around the tree, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to piece together what had happened here. The ground all around the hemlock was torn up and trampled, like there'd been a serious struggle days or weeks earlier. Broken branches littered the area, some snapped cleanly and others torn raggedly from nearby bushes. Disturbed earth showed deep gouges and scrape marks in the dirt, patterns that suggested violent resistance, dragging, fighting. Whatever had happened in this clearing had been violent and chaotic. Scattered around the base of the tree were food scraps in various stages of decay, rotting fish, heads and tails and bones, picked mostly clean. Mashed berries forming dark stains on the forest floor covered with ants, torn vegetation, leaves and roots and stems, scattered carelessly. It looked like someone had been feeding the Bigfoot but had stopped recently. The fresher scraps, fish that still had some flesh on the bones and berries that hadn't completely decomposed, were maybe 3 or 4 days old. The older scraps were further out from the tree, nearly returned to soil, suggesting weeks of regular feedings that had suddenly ceased. Someone had been keeping this Bigfoot alive intentionally, bringing food on a schedule, then abruptly stopped. My mind was racing. This creature had been left here to die. That much was obvious. But who had done it? Other Bigfoot? That seemed impossible, but the more I looked at the evidence, the more it made a twisted kind of sense. The rope was made from natural materials, twisted and woven with skill, but without any modern tools. The sign was carved with something sharp, but crude, stone maybe. And those tally marks suggested someone had been counting days. 37 days this Bigfoot had been tied to this tree. I stood there wrestling with myself. Every logical part of my brain screamed at me to get the hell out of there. This was dangerous. This was insane. I should radio for help, get authorities involved, let someone else handle it. But another part of me couldn't walk away from a living thing left to suffer like this. I've spent my whole adult life in the woods. I've seen injured animals before, helped where I could. This felt the same despite the fact that what I was looking at shouldn't exist. And those eyes, I kept coming back to those eyes watching me. There was intelligence there, awareness. This wasn't just an animal. I remembered all those stories locals had told me over the years about Bigfoot being smart, almost human in how they thought and acted. Looking at this creature now, seeing the way it watched me with clear understanding of its situation, I couldn't deny what I was seeing. I made my decision. Probably the most reckless decision of my life, but I made it anyway. I pulled out my surveying knife, a good sharp blade I used for cutting rope and marking trees. I approached slowly, hands visible, moving with deliberate care. The Bigfoot tensed as I got closer but didn't struggle or try to break free. It just watched me with those pleading eyes. The rope was incredibly tough. Tougher than any rope I'd worked with before. Whoever made it knew exactly what they were doing. The fibers were woven tight and strong, layer upon layer, twisted together with precision. The rope had been there long enough to settle deep into the tree bark and embed itself in the Bigfoot's fur. In some places, the fur had actually grown around the rope, incorporating it into the coat. I started with the bindings around the wrists, sawing carefully through layer after layer of twisted vine and bark strips. Each strand took effort to cut through. My knife was sharp, but this rope resisted. The Bigfoot remained completely still the entire time, barely breathing, like it was afraid any movement might startle me or make me stop. I could feel it watching me, feel the tension in its body as I worked. My hands started cramping from the repetitive sawing motion. Sweat dripped down my face despite the cool forest air. The first wrist binding finally gave way with a sharp snap that made us both flinch. It took almost an hour to cut through all the ropes. My hands cramped up twice, and I had to stop to rest. The whole time, the Bigfoot just waited, patient and quiet. When I finally cut through the last binding around its legs, the rope fell away and the Bigfoot slumped against the tree. It was too weak to stand on its own. Its legs buckled and it just sat there at the base of the tree, breathing hard, free but unable to move. I backed away fast, putting 20 feet between us. Every muscle in my body was ready to run if the Bigfoot turned aggressive, but it didn't. It just sat there slumped against the tree, drawing in deep breaths, flexing its wrists where the rope had cut into the skin. The wounds looked painful, raw and inflamed. After several minutes of just sitting and breathing, the Bigfoot slowly pushed itself up, using the tree trunk for support. Instead of running into the forest like I expected, the Bigfoot turned toward me. My heart jumped into my throat. I was already calculating which direction to run, whether I could make it to my pack before this thing caught me. But then the Bigfoot did something that froze me in place. It bowed its head. Not a slight nod, but a full, deliberate bow, lowering its head and shoulders toward me in what could only be a gesture of respect or gratitude. The Bigfoot reached down and picked up the wooden sign that was still hanging from the rope around its neck. It grabbed the sign in both hands and with one sharp movement snapped it in half. The crack echoed across the clearing. Then it tossed both pieces aside like it was disposing of something shameful or painful. The Bigfoot made a soft grunting sound, low and almost gentle. Then it turned and started limping toward the edge of the clearing, moving slowly and carefully like every step hurt. It got about halfway to the tree line and stopped, turned back to look at me one more time. And in that moment, I saw something in its expression that I can't explain. Recognition maybe, understanding, gratitude definitely, but also something deeper. Like this creature was actually thinking, processing what had just happened, what it meant. Then it disappeared into the forest. I stood there for another 10 minutes, just breathing, trying to process what had happened. Eventually, I gathered up my gear and headed back to my camp. But I couldn't stop thinking about that Bigfoot, about the sign and the tally marks, about who had tied it there and why, about where it was going now. I should have left the valley right then, should have radioed my supervisor and told them I needed to wrap up early. Instead, I stayed, told myself I needed to finish the survey work. But really, I think I wanted to know what would happen next. Some part of me needed to understand what I'd just witnessed. That night at my camp, I kept replaying everything in my head. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that other Bigfoot had tied up that creature. The materials, the methods, the sign with its crude carvings, none of it was human work. This was Bigfoot dealing with one of their own, some kind of punishment or exile. The marked figure on the sign separated from the others, the arrows pointing away. It all suggested banishment. And the tally marks meant someone had been counting the days, 37 days of punishment. The food scraps told another part of the story. Whoever tied up the Bigfoot hadn't meant for it to die, at least not right away. They'd been bringing food periodically, keeping it alive, teaching it a lesson maybe. But something had changed 3 or 4 days ago. The food deliveries stopped. Either the punishment was supposed to end with death, or something else had interrupted their routine. The next morning, I made another decision I probably shouldn't have. Instead of continuing my survey work, I decided to follow the Bigfoot's trail. The creature had been injured and weak. It couldn't have gone far. I grabbed my pack, made sure I had enough water and supplies, and headed into the forest in the direction the Bigfoot had disappeared. The trail wasn't hard to follow. Broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, occasional prints in soft earth. The Bigfoot had been moving slowly, stopping frequently based on the evidence. After about 2 miles, the trail led me toward a small stream cutting through a rocky section of the valley. I slowed down, moving more carefully now, keeping quiet. I heard the water before I saw it. The stream was running fast over smooth stones, making enough noise to cover my approach. I crept up to a stand of alders and peered through the branches. The Bigfoot I'd freed was there, kneeling by the stream, drinking deeply. It stayed like that for a long time, just drinking and drinking like it couldn't get enough. Then it moved to sit on a large boulder near the water's edge. I found a fallen log about 50 yards away and crouched behind it, watching. The Bigfoot just sat there on the boulder, gathering strength. Its breathing was still labored, and it kept looking at its wounded wrist. Every few minutes, it would glance around nervously, scanning the forest. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. Then I heard it, a strange hooting sound echoing from somewhere deeper in the forest. It wasn't like any bird call I'd ever heard. The Bigfoot on the boulder went rigid, head snapping up. The hooting came again, closer this time, and the Bigfoot responded with its own series of hoots and grunts. The sounds weren't random animal noises. They had pattern, variation, rhythm, communication. 3 more Bigfoot emerged from the tree line on the far side of the stream. 2 were slightly smaller than the one I'd freed, probably 7 feet tall, with lighter brown fur that caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. One was massive, easily 9 feet tall, with broader shoulders and darker fur, almost black in the shadows. Muscles rippled under its coat as it moved. This was clearly the dominant member of the group, the leader or alpha. They moved into the open space near the stream and stopped dead when they saw the freed Bigfoot sitting on the boulder. The air went electric with tension. For a long moment, nobody moved. The silence was so intense I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The 3 newcomers stood frozen, staring at their companion, who should have still been tied to that tree miles away. I could see confusion in their postures, shock in the way they held themselves perfectly still. Then the 3 newcomers rushed forward, splashing through the shallow stream, but they stopped short of the boulder, and I could see shock in their body language. They gathered around the freed Bigfoot, examining the wounds on its wrists and ankles, making agitated sounds. One of the smaller ones reached out to touch the injuries, and the freed Bigfoot flinched but didn't pull away. The big one, clearly the dominant member of the group, started pacing back and forth. It was making aggressive gestures, sweeping its arms, pounding one fist into the other palm. The freed Bigfoot held up its hands in what looked like a calming gesture, then started making its own sounds and gestures. It pointed back in the direction of the clearing where it had been tied. Then it touched its own chest. Then it made a gesture toward the forest around us. I watched this exchange, and even though I couldn't understand the specific communication, the general meaning was clear. The freed Bigfoot was explaining what had happened. The other 3 were reacting, arguing maybe, or debating what it meant. The big one seemed angry at first, but gradually its posture changed. It moved closer to the freed Bigfoot and placed one massive hand on its shoulder. The gesture looked like acceptance, forgiveness maybe. Then everything changed. One of the smaller Bigfoot suddenly went completely still. Its head turned slowly, nostrils flaring. It was scenting the air, and then it looked directly at the log I was hiding behind. My blood went cold. The Bigfoot made a sharp barking sound, and all four of them went on high alert. They knew I was there. I should have run. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to run. But I stayed frozen behind that log, watching as the group of Bigfoot turned their attention toward my hiding spot. The three newcomers moved into protective positions, putting themselves between me and the freed Bigfoot. Their body language was defensive, wary, ready for a threat. But then the freed Bigfoot stepped forward. It positioned itself between me and the others, facing them, not me. It started making sounds, urgent, insistent sounds. It gestured toward where I was hiding, then touched its own chest where the wounds from the rope were visible, then made that same bowing motion it had made to me in the clearing. The other Bigfoot watched and listened. The big one tilted its head, considering. Slowly, the defensive postures relaxed. The freed Bigfoot turned toward me and made a soft hooting sound, not threatening, almost beckoning. It was telling me it was safe, or at least I hoped that's what it meant. Very slowly, I stood up from behind the log, keeping my hands visible and empty. All four Bigfoot watched me intently. None of them moved aggressively, but I could feel the tension in the air. The freed Bigfoot bent down and picked up a large piece of bark from the ground. It found a sharp rock and started scratching marks into the bark. The process took several minutes while I stood there watching, barely breathing, very aware that three other Bigfoot were watching me with cautious interest. Finally, the freed Bigfoot finished whatever it was making and started walking toward me. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The Bigfoot approached slowly, holding out the piece of bark. It stopped about 10 feet away from me, crouched down, and placed the bark on the ground. Then it backed up several steps and made a gesture toward the bark, offering it to me. I moved forward carefully and picked up the bark. Scratched into the surface was a crude drawing. A stick figure that was clearly meant to be human. A larger figure that was clearly meant to be Bigfoot. Between them, a line connected the two figures. Below that, more tally marks, and a symbol that looked like two hands clasped together, a handshake. I looked up from the bark to meet the freed Bigfoot's eyes. It was watching me intently, waiting for my reaction. I understood what the message meant. Debt acknowledged, peace offered, a connection between two different beings who had helped each other. I nodded slowly, gripping the bark. The Bigfoot made a soft sound that might have been satisfaction or relief, then something incredible happened. The other three Bigfoot began moving closer, not threatening, but curious. They spread out in a loose semicircle around me, examining me the way you might examine something fascinating but unfamiliar. The big one leaned down slightly, tilting its head, studying my face. One of the smaller ones reached out slowly and touched the fabric of my jacket, rubbing it between its fingers like it was testing the material. The freed Bigfoot made another gesture, this time beckoning me to follow. The group started moving along the stream, heading deeper into the valley. I hesitated for only a moment before following. What else was I going to do? I'd already crossed every line of reasonable behavior. Might as well see where this led. We walked for maybe 20 minutes, following the stream as it wound deeper into the valley. The Bigfoot moved through the forest with surprising grace despite their size. They knew exactly where they were going, stepping over roots and ducking under branches with practiced ease. I struggled to keep up. Crashing through undergrowth, they seemed to glide past. Eventually, we came to an area where massive trees had fallen years ago, creating a natural shelter. The trunks were enormous, old-growth timber that must have come down in a major storm. They'd fallen in such a way that they formed walls and a partial roof, leaving a protected space underneath. The Bigfoot led me inside the shelter, and I realized I was looking at their home. Inside the shelter, evidence of Bigfoot habitation was everywhere. Woven reed mats covered the ground in sections, sleeping areas probably, arranged in a pattern that suggested individual spaces within the communal home. The weaving was remarkably tight and even, showing real skill. Food stores lined one wall, organized in baskets made from twisted bark and vines. Different baskets held different things: dried fish in one, nuts and seeds in another, dried berries in a third. Everything was sorted and stored with purpose. There were tools scattered around, crude by human standards, but clearly functional and well made. Sharp stones for cutting, edges worn smooth from repeated use. Smooth rocks for grinding, hollowed slightly in the center from years of work. Sturdy sticks shaped and hardened by fire, their tips sharpened to points or shaped into hooks. Some look like digging tools, others like weapons or fishing implements. Everything showed planning, organization, intelligence. These Bigfoot had created a home, not just a shelter. They had possessions, storage systems, division of labor. It was like looking at a snapshot of early human society, but happening right now in this hidden valley. The big Bigfoot gestured for me to sit. I lowered myself onto one of the reed mats, keeping my pack close. The freed Bigfoot I'd helped sat down across from me, and the other two settled nearby. For a long moment, we all just looked at each other. It was surreal, sitting in a Bigfoot home, surrounded by creatures that weren't supposed to exist, being treated like a guest rather than a threat. One of the smaller Bigfoot reached into a basket and pulled out food, berries, roots, some kind of dried fish. They offered it to me with clear gestures. "Eat, please." I took some berries carefully, trying not to seem rude. They tasted wild and slightly bitter, but not bad. The Bigfoot seemed pleased that I'd accepted their offering. They passed food around among themselves, eating in a way that seemed almost ceremonial. Everyone got an equal share. As I sat there eating berries with a family of Bigfoot, I started noticing the social dynamics. The big one was clearly in charge, but not in an aggressive way. More like a father or group leader making sure everyone was okay. The two smaller ones, I started thinking of them as siblings maybe, stayed close to each other, occasionally grooming each other's fur. And the freed Bigfoot stayed near me, like it was my guide or protector in this situation. After we ate, the freed Bigfoot started trying to communicate. It used the same method as before, drawing in the dirt floor of the shelter with a stick. First, it drew multiple Bigfoot figures standing together. Then it drew a pile that I realized was supposed to represent food. It drew itself taking from the pile, then the other Bigfoot figures surrounding it in angry poses. Then it drew itself being led away and tied to a tree. I watched as the story unfolded in crude drawings. The freed Bigfoot had taken food from a communal cache, food that belonged to the whole group. The others had caught it, confronted it, and decided on punishment: exile to the tree. The Bigfoot drew more figures approaching the tree over time, leaving small amounts of food. They were keeping it alive, but barely, teaching it a lesson about stealing from the group. Then the Bigfoot drew a figure that was clearly meant to be me. It showed me cutting the ropes, freeing it. It touched its chest where the wounds were still visible, then pointed at me. Gratitude was obvious in the gesture, but then it drew something else. The group of Bigfoot returning to the tree to find the freed Bigfoot gone. It drew angry gestures, confusion, and finally it drew the group finding the freed Bigfoot by the stream, with me watching from hiding. I was starting to understand. By freeing the Bigfoot early, I'd accidentally interrupted their justice system. The punishment wasn't meant to end in death, at least not directly. It was supposed to be 37 days of suffering to teach a lesson about respecting group resources. But I cut it short, and now the group had to decide what that meant. The big Bigfoot leaned forward and started gesturing, adding to the story in the dirt. It showed the freed Bigfoot explaining what happened. Then it drew me again, showing compassion, helping, and finally it drew a symbol. The same handshake symbol from the bark. The group had accepted what happened. Maybe they saw my intervention as a sign that the freed Bigfoot had learned its lesson. Maybe they just recognized that I'd acted out of kindness rather than defiance of their rules. We sat there for hours. The light filtering through the fallen trees shifted as afternoon moved toward evening. The Bigfoot showed me more of their lives through gestures and drawings. How they gathered food, working together to forage and fish. How they took turns keeping watch at night. How younger Bigfoot, children I guessed, learned from the adults. They had structure, society, rules. They weren't just smart animals, they were people in their own way. At one point, movement at the edge of the shelter caught my attention. A smaller Bigfoot appeared, much smaller than the others, maybe adolescent. It peered inside nervously, curious but cautious. One of the adults made a beckoning gesture, and the young one crept inside. It stared at me with huge eyes full of wonder and fear. The adults made gentle sounds, reassuring it. Eventually, the young Bigfoot settled down near the others and just watched me, fascinated. Watching that young Bigfoot, I realized these creatures had families, raised children, taught them how to survive. The complexity of what I was witnessing hit me hard. These weren't monsters or myths. They were living beings with their own culture, their own ways of doing things. And I was sitting right in the middle of it. As the sun started getting lower, I knew I needed to think about heading back to my camp. I had a few hours of daylight left, maybe, and I didn't want to be stumbling through the forest in the dark. I stood up slowly, pointing back in the direction I needed to go. The Bigfoot understood immediately. They stood as well, and I could see something like regret in their postures. They'd enjoyed the strange meeting as much as I had. The freed Bigfoot walked me back toward the edge of their territory, with the big one accompanying us. We walked in comfortable silence, just moving through the forest together. When we got near the clearing where I'd first found the Bigfoot tied to the tree, they both stopped. The freed Bigfoot led me to the hemlock tree, and we stood there looking at the cut rope still hanging from the trunk. The Bigfoot made a sound that I somehow knew was laughter, dark humor about its situation, about what it had endured. Then it did something unexpected. It gathered up the broken pieces of the wooden sign and all the cut ropes. It carried everything to a nearby ravine and dropped it all in, then started covering the evidence with rocks and dirt from the ravine walls. It was hiding the evidence, protecting its family from discovery. When it finished burying the ropes and sign, the freed Bigfoot turned back to me. It pointed to itself, then to me, then made a pushing motion with its hands. A warning. Stay away. I understood. If other humans came, especially in groups, the Bigfoot would hide or leave. This encounter had only been possible because I was alone, because I'd shown compassion instead of aggression. But then the Bigfoot did something that made my heart skip. It knelt down and drew one more picture in the dirt. A single human figure, a single Bigfoot figure meeting at the hemlock tree. Then it pointed to the moon above us and made a circular gesture twice. 2 months. It was giving me an invitation to return in 2 months alone to this spot. The freed Bigfoot extended one massive hand toward me. I stared at it for a moment, then reached out and clasped its hand in mine. The handshake between our two species felt momentous, impossible, and completely natural all at the same time. The Bigfoot's hand was rough and powerful, but its grip was gentle. We stood there for a moment, hands clasped, looking at each other. Then it released my hand, made a soft farewell sound, and melted back into the forest shadows with the big Bigfoot following. I stood alone in the clearing as darkness started falling over the valley. I could still feel the weight of that handshake, the warmth of that massive hand in mine. Eventually, I turned and made my way back to my camp, processing everything that had happened. My mind was spinning with questions and realizations and images I'd never forget. That night in my tent, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I'd witnessed. These creatures had rules, justice systems, family structures. The freed Bigfoot had committed what they considered a serious crime, taking food from communal resources that everyone depended on. The punishment had been harsh, but not designed to kill outright. They'd kept it fed, kept it alive, forced it to endure suffering as a lesson. And when I interrupted that process, they'd accepted it because they recognized compassion when they saw it. I finished my survey work over the next 3 days, but my heart wasn't in it. I was just going through the motions, taking measurements, marking boundaries, documenting terrain. The whole time I was thinking about the Bigfoot family living in that hidden shelter, going about their lives just a few miles away. I was thinking about the freed Bigfoot and the debt it felt it owed me. I was thinking about that invitation to return. When I finally packed up and hiked back to where my truck was parked, I felt like I was leaving something important behind. The drive back to civilization felt surreal. I stopped at a diner, ordered coffee, and sat there watching normal people doing normal things. They had no idea what was living in those remote valleys. They had no idea that Bigfoot weren't just real, but intelligent, social, complex beings with their own culture. I couldn't tell anyone what I'd experienced. Who would believe it? Even with the piece of bark the freed Bigfoot had given me, still in my pack, I had no real proof. And more importantly, I didn't want to tell anyone. I didn't want hunters flooding that valley. I didn't want researchers setting up equipment and cameras. I didn't want the Bigfoot family harassed or captured or turned into specimens for study. They deserved to live their lives in peace. I went back to my regular work, surveying other areas, staying busy, but I marked my calendar. 2 months from that day in the clearing, I didn't know if I'd actually go back. Part of me thought maybe it was better to leave it as a perfect, impossible memory. But another part of me couldn't let it go. I kept thinking about that invitation drawn in the dirt, about the handshake, about the trust the Bigfoot had shown me. The 2 months passed slowly. I kept myself occupied with work, but my mind kept drifting back to that valley. Finally, the day came. I loaded my pack, made sure I had plenty of supplies, and drove back out to the access road. The hike-in took most of the day. When I reached the hemlock tree clearing, the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the open space. I sat down at the base of the tree and waited. The light faded slowly. Birds called from the surrounding forest. Wind moved through the branches overhead. I waited for 2 hours, maybe 3. Started to think maybe the Bigfoot wouldn't come. Maybe the invitation had been polite, but not genuine. Maybe they'd decided it was too dangerous to maintain contact with a human. Just as I was about to give up and make camp for the night, accepting that maybe the invitation hadn't been genuine, I heard movement in the trees to my left. Branches rustled. Something large was moving through the undergrowth. My pulse quickened. The freed Bigfoot emerged from the shadows slowly, carefully, moving with deliberate caution as if testing whether I was truly alone. It looked so much healthier than before. The wounds on its wrists had healed to thick scars, visible through the fur as raised lines of tissue. It moved with more strength and confidence, no longer weakened by starvation and exposure. Its coat was cleaner, groomed, the matted patches gone. This was a Bigfoot that had been welcomed back into its community, cared for, restored. It saw me sitting there against the tree and stopped about 20 feet away. We made eye contact, and I saw recognition flash in those intelligent eyes. Then it made a soft, welcoming sound, a low, gentle hoot that somehow conveyed both greeting and relief. Relief that I'd actually come back. Relief that the connection between us was real and ongoing. The Bigfoot approached the tree and sat down a few feet away from me. We looked at each other for a long moment. Then I reached into my pack and pulled out supplies I'd brought: dried fruit, energy bars, a good quality knife, a waterproof tarp. I laid them out on the ground between us. The Bigfoot examined each item carefully, picking them up, testing them, showing clear interest. In return, the Bigfoot had brought offerings for me. A woven bracelet made from grass and fibers, intricate and beautiful, polished stones that caught the fading light. A bundle of plants I recognized as having medicinal properties. Locals use them for treating wounds and infections. The Bigfoot placed these items in front of me with clear intention. Trade, gifts, exchange between equals. We sat there as darkness fell completely. The Bigfoot didn't invite me to follow it back to the shelter. Maybe that was too much risk, or maybe the family had decided one meeting was enough. But we sat together in comfortable silence under the stars, two very different beings who'd formed an unlikely connection. Eventually, the Bigfoot stood, touched its chest, then pointed at me. Until next time, then it disappeared into the forest, leaving me alone with my gifts and my thoughts. I made camp right there by the tree that night. In the morning, I buried the items the Bigfoot had left for me in a cache nearby, marking the spot carefully so I could find it again. Then I hiked back out to my truck. Over the following weeks, I established a pattern. Once a month, I'd return to the hemlock tree. Sometimes the freed Bigfoot would be there, sometimes not. When it was there, we'd exchange items. I'd bring useful supplies, tools, food, materials. The Bigfoot would bring gifts from the forest, things that showed thought and care. I never saw the Bigfoot face to face again after those first meetings. But I found evidence they were using the things I left. The knife I'd given them showed up again months later, sharpened to a much finer edge, using techniques I didn't know. The tarp disappeared for a while, then reappeared worn and carefully repaired with natural fibers woven through tears. They were using my gifts, adapting them, making them their own. This silent exchange became the most important part of my life. It was our secret, mine and theirs. A connection between species that defied logic but felt completely right. I never tried to push for more contact. Never brought cameras or recording equipment. Never marked trails or left signs that might lead others to their location. I protected them the only way I could, through silence and discretion. Sometimes I return to that valley for work. When I do, I'm always alert for signs of them. Occasionally I find evidence, tracks in soft earth, broken branches at heights no human could reach, woven grass markers that seem to say they're still there, still watching. But I never see them directly. They've given me the gift of knowing they exist, and in return, I give them the gift of privacy. Looking back on that day, I found the Bigfoot tied to the tree. I realized how easily things could have gone differently. I could have run away in fear, convinced myself I was seeing things, fled that valley, and never returned. I could have left the creature to die, told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that nature was cruel and I shouldn't interfere. I could have reported what I found and brought authorities crashing into their world. Park rangers, researchers, camera crews, hunters. The Bigfoot family would have been exposed, studied, captured, turned into specimens or attractions. Their peaceful existence in that hidden valley would have ended. Instead, I made a choice to help without thinking through all the consequences. A choice based on pure compassion, on the simple recognition that a living, thinking being was suffering and needed help. And that choice opened up something I never imagined possible. A connection across species, a friendship of sorts, a mutual understanding that transcends language and form. It showed me that the world is full of mysteries we haven't begun to understand, intelligence we haven't acknowledged, beauty we haven't noticed because we're too busy looking for what we expect to find rather than seeing what's actually there. I learned that Bigfoot aren't monsters or myths. They're people in their own way. They have justice systems that seem harsh to us but make sense in their world. They have rules about sharing resources because in the wilderness, hoarding can mean death for others. They punish those who break the rules, but the punishment is designed to teach, not just to harm. And they're capable of recognizing kindness and responding to it with trust. The freed Bigfoot could have attacked me that first day. It was bigger, stronger, had every reason to see me as a threat. Instead, it bowed its head in gratitude. The family could have driven me away when they discovered me watching them. Instead, they invited me in, shared food with me, showed me their lives. They took a massive risk trusting me, and I've spent every day since trying to be worthy of that trust. Most people will never believe this story. That's fine. I'm not trying to convince anyone or prove anything. I'm just sharing what happened to me because I think it matters. Somewhere in the remote valleys of the Pacific Northwest, there are beings who think and feel and live according to their own rules. They're not threatening humans or causing problems. They're just trying to survive, to raise their children, to live their lives in peace. Every month when I return to the hemlock tree, I think about that first encounter. The fear I felt seeing something impossible standing before me, bound and suffering. The moral struggle of deciding whether to help, whether to risk everything for a creature I didn't understand. The moment of connection when I realized I was looking at someone, not something, a being with thoughts and feelings and awareness. The gratitude in those eyes when the last rope fell away and freedom returned. The trust extended to me by an entire family who had every reason to fear humans, every reason to see me as a threat to their safety and way of life. They chose trust instead of fear. They chose connection instead of retreat. And that choice changed everything for me. It changed how I see the world, how I understand intelligence and consciousness, how I think about what it means to be human or non-human. The line between us isn't as clear as we've been taught. Intelligence exists in many forms. Compassion and gratitude aren't uniquely human traits. And sometimes the most profound connections happen between beings who should, by all logic, never meet. I keep the grass bracelet the Bigfoot gave me in my desk drawer at home. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, remembering. The weaving is incredibly intricate, showing patience and skill. It reminds me that intelligence and consciousness aren't uniquely human traits. They exist in forms we don't expect, in beings we've dismissed as myths. Some secrets are meant to protect, not to prove. This is one of those secrets. I'm sharing the story because people should know that Bigfoot are real. But I'll never reveal the exact location of that valley. I'll never bring anyone else there. I'll never try to document or capture evidence beyond what I've experienced. The Bigfoot trusted me with knowledge of their existence. The least I can do is protect them from the consequences of that knowledge. As I write this, I'm preparing for my next monthly visit to the tree. I've gathered supplies, more tools, dried food, warm clothing for the approaching winter. I don't know if the freed Bigfoot will be there this time. Sometimes months go by with no direct contact, just the silent exchange of items left and taken. But I keep going back because I made a promise, even if it was never spoken out loud, a promise to respect them, to protect them, to maintain the fragile connection we've built. The freed Bigfoot could have died tied to that tree. Instead, it lived. We both learned something that day about crossing the boundaries that separate us, about seeing past differences to recognize the common ground, about choosing compassion over fear. That lesson has stayed with me every day since. When I die, this story will probably die with me. I've never told anyone the full truth until now. I haven't shared the location, haven't tried to prove what I experienced, haven't sought recognition or validation. Maybe someday another person will have their own encounter, their own moment of connection with these beings. Maybe they'll also choose to protect rather than expose. Or maybe Bigfoot will remain hidden, protected by distance and mystery and the good intentions of the few humans who've met them. Either way, I know the truth. I've sat in their home, shared their food, received their trust. I've seen their intelligence, their social bonds, their capacity for forgiveness and gratitude. I've held the hand of a being that isn't human, but isn't less than human either. That day in the clearing changed me. I can't look at the forest the same way anymore. Every time I'm surveying in remote areas, I wonder if they're watching. Every strange sound makes me alert to possibilities I would have dismissed before. And every month when I return to the hemlock tree, I feel grateful for the gift I was given. The gift of knowing that the world is stranger and more wonderful than most people imagine. The freed Bigfoot gave me that grass bracelet as a symbol of our connection. But the real gift was something else, the gift of trust, the gift of being allowed to witness something extraordinary, the gift of understanding that intelligence and emotion exist in forms we've never acknowledged. That gift is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. So yes, I found a Bigfoot tied to a tree with a strange message. And what happened next did shock me, but not in the way the title of the story might suggest. I wasn't shocked by violence or danger. I was shocked by connection, by recognition, by the realization that the line between human and non-human intelligence is much blurrier than we've been taught to believe. The hemlock tree still stands in that clearing, showing no signs of what happened there. The cut ropes are buried in the ravine, hidden beneath rocks and dirt. The wooden sign with its crude carvings is gone forever. But the memory remains clear and vivid and absolutely real. And once a month, I return to honor the promise I made, even if it was never spoken, to protect them, to respect them, to maintain the secret that keeps them safe. I wonder sometimes if the freed Bigfoot thinks about me the way I think about it. Does it remember the moment I cut the last rope and it was finally free? Does it remember the handshake we shared? Does it understand that I've kept my silent promise to protect their existence? I hope so. I hope it knows that the compassion it showed me by trusting me has been returned every single day since. This is my story. This is what happened when I found something impossible and chose to believe my eyes rather than my assumptions. This is what happens when two different species meet without fear, when compassion bridges the gap between the known and the unknown. And this is why some secrets need to be protected even as they're shared, because the world isn't ready for Bigfoot. But Bigfoot deserves to exist without the world crashing down on them. 3 weeks ago, I found a Bigfoot tied to a tree. Today, I'm heading back to that tree to see if it left me a message in return. The exchange continues. The connection holds. And somewhere in a hidden valley, a family of Bigfoot lives their lives in peace, protected by silence and by the promise I made the day I chose to cut those ropes and set one of them free. For more interesting stories, check this out.